Hey everybody, this is Dr. Wilderman, um, uh, lecturing for Multimedia Journalism 3003, and I just want to talk to you today about the writing approach that we want you to use in your in the writing component of your final project. So we're going to talk a little bit about the five graph or first five graph approach. There is a PowerPoint in your Canvas files to go along with this lecture. So you might hear this concept of news writing referred to as five graph or first five graphs approach. And that's because you can view it as a complete structure for a story, as in there are only five main paragraphs, and each one of them is going to follow one of these pieces. Or you can think of it as within the first five paragraphs of your story, you should accomplish these elements. And so you see stories in both styles. But regardless of which approach you take, the key elements are the same. Now, in the writing class before this, in JMC 2033 or an equivalent if you took it elsewhere, you should have learned about the inverted pyramid structure for news writing, and that's great. That's a great place to start. But there are other news writing structures. So this five graph or first five graph approach has some similar elements of inverted pyramid, but there's also some differences. So let's take a look, or I'm taking a look. Let's talk about those five key elements and what they are and go over each element. All right, so the key elements for five graph or first five graph, that's going to be the news, the impact, the context, the human element, and what's next. So let's break down each one of these. All right, for the news, think of it as the what. All right, it's the newest information. It's going to be basic facts. Think 5 W's and H. It is going to be the most relevant information, like the reason you're writing this story, right, is going to come first. A lot of this element is what you would probably think about being covered in the lead, right? Think back to that inverted pyramid structure. Yeah, most important information right up front. And so a lot of this, the news or the what, is going to be like in your first couple of sentences in that lead. So questions that it usually answers, all right? This element, this news element, will usually answer questions like what happened, why did it happen, what's the real story? I think of the real story as the so what, right? Like, okay, well, this thing happened. So what? Why do we care? It could also answer the question of what are people's reactions to this thing that happened? Okay, so then aside from just knowing what these elements are, I want to talk about for each one of them, like how do you get that into your story? What do you need to do to make that happen in your story? So for this first element of the news, you're going to want to do things like upfront, brainstorm with your editor or other colleagues. So of course, in a student setting, brainstorming with your instructor or brainstorming with fellow members of your class. Think about all of the sources that would be helpful to get you good information on that topic, right? Think about those sources and then work to get in contact with those sources. Think about the different angles of this topic. So too many times I hear people say, let's make sure you cover both sides of the story. Very rarely are there just two sides or two perspectives. There's usually more than that. So get out of the habit of just thinking of both sides and think of multiple perspective. All right, another tip for getting the news element is to ask questions and do research until you understand, right? If you don't understand a component of your topic, how are you going to express that to the readers so that they understand it? If you don't understand, I don't know how you're going to make that happen. We got to ask questions till we understand. And then also think about the hook, right? That's something we talked about in 2033. The hook is every lead needs a hook. What is the interesting, different, unique, timely, one of those? What makes this story worth reading right now? What's going to get people's attention to read this story right now? All right, so that's the first element of the five graph approach. Second element is the impact. All right, so the impact is, who is affected by this? Who and what are affected by this? So questions that the impact will usually answer. So if you're reporting and covering the impact of a story, of a situation, of a moment, some questions that your reporting should answer are things like, what's the fallout from this situation? Who is benefiting or who is suffering because of the situation? Why is it interesting? What does it all mean? What do readers need to do, right? Like, not every story means that a reader, affects a reader so personally that, like, they have to think about, well, what should I or shouldn't I do based on this story? But a lot of stories do. I mean, I think of the COVID numbers that are reported for Oklahoma and for Norman every day. When I look at those stories, I ask myself questions like, is there any, do I need to change my behavior in any way related to, these numbers going up or down? Another question to answer to help with reporting on impact is to answer what has changed because of this thing that happened. All right, so then moving on to still talking about impact, but how do you, as the reporter, go about getting the impact into your story? What actions do you need to take? Okay, so first of all, you need to report thoroughly. That goes back to the multiple perspectives thing, right? Don't leave an element out of the story that should be in the story, right? Multiple perspectives are also going to show multiple impact. Look beyond that obvious impact. There's a first layer of impact, like we'll almost automatically always think of, but explore the ripple effects of the impact or the layers of the impact, right? Think about, this first tier of people is affected. What's the next tier? Look for the different types of impact: positive, negative, gray areas, right? Almost always something that affects one group negatively, like there's somebody out there who it's affecting positively. Focused on the most important impact first, right? Like give a hierarchy to the way that you report on the impact, right? You could think of that in terms of the concept of, we sort of have a hierarchy in the way that we think about tragedy and how we report it, right? Deaths are most important and should be reported on first. Deaths, injury to people, then complete destruction of property, then damage to property, right? If you're reporting on damage to property first when people have died, you're not focusing on the most important impact first. Another way to get the impact into your story, using strong verbs and interesting description in as you write, and getting quotes from your sources that help convey that impact as well. All right, moving on. Number 3, the third element of this 5 graph is the context. All right, so I think this is the element that gets left out of stories too frequently, or it's the element that if it's in the story, there's not enough of it. And I see this even in really quality publications and experienced reporters. All right, so the context is the stuff that frames the background of the situation, offers the relevant history leading up to this moment, puts the elements that are around this news story into perspective. So it helps people who maybe are reading about this topic for the first time. It helps them understand, previous and historical information, on the topic, so that they're not left out of the loop when they're reading this story. So questions that context might answer. It will answer things like, what led to this? What's normal or not normal about this moment? What does it mean to various groups of people? If it's happened before or something similar has happened before, how was it dealt with earlier? How are other people in other places dealing with it? Yeah, if they had an instance of something similar. What's the need to be writing it right now? So what can you do as the reporter then to make sure that you're writing enough context and getting enough context into your story? So think about what, again, like I said, the person who's new to this topic, right? What do they need to know? Think about terms that you're using, acronyms that you might be using, organizations, people's names. Like, you might absolutely know what this acronym means or why a certain person is being interviewed and is important to the story, but you've got to explain that. You've got to set the context for your readers. Research the history around your story. That's another way to help provide context, right? Ask questions, again, ask questions until you understand. Ask questions, do the research until you understand. The understanding the background, what led to this moment, is just as important as reporting the new moment. Putting it in context helps so much for readers to understand your work. All right, moving on to the fourth element. The fourth element is all about people, right? The fourth element is the human dimension. So remember that ultimately people are interested in other people. News does not exist in a vacuum. News affects people. The human voice is what takes a situation and puts it in the context of reality, right? Like how it affects people. Personal details help contribute to a reader understanding the impact of a story, the emotion involved. Human dimension is the most natural way to add things like tension, conflict, humor, irony, various emotions. It's the best way to showcase happiness and hope and anger and outrage, fear, sadness. You as the writer, right, aren't supposed to be doing that from a first point perspective. So you do that through your sources, through your human sources. It provides color and texture to our stories. It keeps things from just being brief, or just short news briefs. Short news briefs have their place, but that's not all that news reporting is. News reporting has and needs a human dimension. All right, so how do you get this into your story? This starts well before you're writing, all right? You can't just depend on your writing to add the human dimension. You need to find sources that are connected to the story and can speak to what happened, have informed opinions, and can convey opinion and emotion and knowledge and firsthand experience with your topic. You got to get out and talk to those people. You got to get out and meet people. So I know that during the time of COVID, we might not be sending you in person like we normally would, but at the very least, instead of texting or just calling people, try to get on Zoom. Try to get them face-to-face on camera if you can't be face-to-face safely in person. All right? Absolutely save emailing and texting. We don't want you just emailing and texting for your interviews. At the very least, you need to talk to them on the phone, and we really want you to talk to them on Zoom or if it's safe in person. It's so easy to gloss over emotion and meaning if we are interviewing via text messages or emails. So also to get the human dimension into your story, you got to write good interview questions. You got to ask relevant and meaningful questions that lead to relevant and meaningful answers. You need to exercise your empathy, right? If someone's having a hard time answering a question, give them a minute. Act like a person, let them know it's okay. Like, no rush, right? Take your time. We can come back to that. Get to know your sources as people, all right? Not just because it's the right thing to do, right? Not just because, you shouldn't treat your source like transactionally, like this is just a transaction I need from you, right? You should get to know your sources as people because it's the right thing to do as a human, but also because knowing them helps you write about them, right? In a way that's like more descriptive and authentic. But ultimately, get out and talk to people. Ask them meaningful questions. Then using their words, you're going to get the human dimension into your story. All right. So moving on to the last element of this 5-graph strategy, it's the what's next, right? So now that you've told the story, think about what could that mean in the short term and long term future. All right. So the what's next might address something like a roadmap to the next steps or possible next steps. It gets your readers thinking about where this might go down the line. It puts your story that you have covered, the moment that you've covered, it might put it in a larger picture, right? What does this mean? What does this mean in terms of like adjacent issues, or again, the larger picture. Remember that the what's next is not your outright opinion about what's next, all right? It still develops from your research and interviewing. So I see the places that I see opinion inserted in a news writing too often are the lead and the final paragraph, all right? So the what's next is not your interpretation, your straight up opinion about what's next. How do you get that then? How do you get that into your story? Ask sources who can provide an informed opinion about what they think is next. Again, think about your story in the within a frame of a larger picture, right? If you're reporting on the COVID numbers at OU, all right, maybe you think about that in terms of the larger picture of how other colleges and universities are dealing with this, right? And maybe that provides you a bit of a what's next situation. Think about the questions your readers might have formed from the elements 1 through 4 that you wrote about. You could use those potential questions that you're thinking about then to develop the what's next aspect of your story. From your reporting perspective, the what's next are topics or adjacent topics that would potentially make great stories for you to follow up on in the future. Think about the various paths that different people who are in your story, might take. Think about both the short-term and the long-term potential futures, right? So like what possibly might happen with this topic next week? What might happen with it next year, 5 years, 10 years? All right. So those are the 5 elements, all right? Wrapping up the 5 elements, just a couple of parting tips for the 5-graph or first 5-graph approach. You can absolutely follow the order of those elements, like follow them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and have a very solid structure to your story, all right? Especially for beginning writers, that's a pretty good strategy, all right? Not to say that you always have to follow that order, but it can work. It can work very well to do it that way. Now, keep in mind, there's 3 of us who teach this class. We might want different things from you, and so there may be something that I've said in this lecture, and you may need to verify with your instructor that they want you to do this a certain way. Like for example, I think I'm going to tell my class that they could follow this exact 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 structure, or as long as all of the elements are there, maybe I'm not going to care so much if they're in that exact order. But once again, check with your own instructor because I don't want to speak for them. All right. Now, before you get hung up on a particular structure though, all right, before you get hung up on like, what does this all mean? Do your research and news gathering and interviewing sources in order to have everything you need to write the story. Okay, don't panic about the structure first. Get the work done. And then for a first draft, don't panic so much about the structure being perfect either. For the first draft, get your stuff down on paper. You can worry about shaping and revising and getting a more solid structure in the revising process. Okay. And then that wraps it up for the 5-graph. I just want to leave you, just last list of things I want to leave you with common mistakes that the 3003 instructors at this moment have seen too often in our students' writing. Okay? So in news writing, I want you to avoid writing in first or second person, all right? Using those inclusive pronouns. the student, you all are pretty good about not straightforward just using I and me, but sometimes you'll use words like us, we, our, right? Those are inclusive pronouns. If I say we, that includes me, right? So don't use those inclusive pronouns outside of your direct quotes. Don't quote basic facts. I don't want to quote from the president of an organization and the quote says something like, our next meeting is November 15th. Like, there's no reason to quote that. All right, it's just a basic fact. Just list it. Just write it. Use direct quotes to convey opinion, emotion, firsthand accounts that have interesting details. Right. Avoid shifting verb tenses for no reason. Avoid writing a lead that only partially represents your full story. We notice there's a lead and then the story doesn't fulfill what the lead seems like it should fulfill, right? The lead and the whole of your story, those things should match, right? And then pet peeve of mine is passive voice. Avoid using passive voice. Think back to that SVO, subject, verb, object order from 2033, right? Think, if you have a lengthy, weird sentence, think first, what's the main action? Who's doing that action? Who or what? And then start your sentence there. Start your sentence with who and what is doing the main action. All right, that's enough of that for right now. So there you go. That's your 5-graph approach lecture. Remember, there's a PowerPoint that goes along with it. See you later.